Hello friends, and welcome to a wider world episode of Last Night's Table. Today I'd like to take a look at two of our races which sort of exist on the fringes of a society, but their origin is so weird and tied together that I have to explain both of them at the same time. In order to do so, we have to take a trip to the Isle of Tortles, which is a lush tropical rainforest. The island is quite large, approximately the size of Great Britain, although that's where the similarities end. Most of it is covered in dense foliage and jungle, as well as broody, murky swampland. However, there is a geographical oddity on the north end of the island, which is a large ring of mountains surrounding a very wide plain filled with maize and grain. The term Birdfolk is pretty broad here and doesn't specify a single race such as Aarakocra or Kenku. In fact, we've got everything from toucans to turkey vultures here. We've got birds of paradise and predatory hawks all sort of living in harmony. Although harmony is a pretty strong choice of word. In fact, the birds of Tortles form a sort of caste system, which wasn't necessarily owing to the races of birds that were on the island, but actually their ability. Vertical mobility wasn't very common through the castes, so the vast majority of the population lived as serfs or peasantry, essentially. However, as a largely peaceful island nation with no nearby neighbors, the Birdfolk prospered, became a very technologically advanced race. In fact, they were freakishly technologically advanced. Arthur C. Clarke said that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, so this means that the Birdfolk were basically all magicians. The Birdfolk had access to circuitry, computers, advanced medicine, and genetic engineering, but their crowning achievement was the creation of the airship. Which, when you think about it, isn't as impressive as, say, genetic engineering, but that's a pretty cool thing to have as an airship in any kind of a fantasy setting, and it would have been a very coveted technology if it weren't for the fact that the Birdfolk didn't have any nearby neighbors. And because they didn't have any nearby neighbors and they weren't a particularly exploratory bunch and were enjoying a peaceful life on the island, most of their airships became short-range pleasure craft, essentially. However, there were a few who dared to dream, and research began on a sufficiently advanced airship engine which would allow them to travel to another continent. However, if we do all agree that sufficiently advanced technology is magic, then we probably also agree that magic comes with a cost. And the price of this airship engine was steeper than any of them would have ever seen coming. Rather than starting with a wooden frame and canvas like at Da Vinci or the Wright brothers, the top bird scientists went straight towards gravity manipulation and overwriting the laws of physics as we understand them. Now, as often the case in many sci-fi thrillers like Event Horizon or Doom, weird, freaky things happened as a result. In one experiment, they tore a hole straight through space-time itself and released this large flying serpent known as the Quetzalcoatl. From then on, thanks to Quetzalcoatl's influence, Tortles was surrounded with constant storms. But the bird brain scientists didn't let something as simple as a 3-mile-long flying serpent keep them from their research, so they pressed on anyway. Eventually they were successful and created what they believed to be the perfect airship engine, but by this time the price was pretty steep. The veil between our reality and some other dimension was pretty thin by this point, and all sorts of awfulness was leaking out of it. Demons from the plane of shadows began to appear and terrorize the populace. And at the same time, a sort of wasting, withering sickness was affecting both the birds and their fields. The religious caste chose to put their faith in their guardian spirit, a deity known as Bast, whose mortal shell took the form of an ocelot. The relationship between birds and cats is pretty well known, and Bast was a god who demanded blood sacrifice. And that was on a good day. When the trouble started, and both demons and plague were ravaging the land, Bast's demands increased to a fevered pitch. The high priest was eager to please Bast and offered whatever he wanted, although it didn't seem to actually be helping any. However, the academic caste reasoned that if science got them into this problem, it could surely get them out, began working on a solution of their own. Having observed that nature always finds a way to restore some semblance of balance, their decision was to try to essentially just wait it out. A scientist known as Cacolotl created a sort of mutant birdfolk with toughened scales and sharp claws suitable for fighting demons. This became the first lizardfolk. By all accounts, Cacolotl's creature was a success, so he created another larger batch, this time a clutch of over 100 eggs. Meanwhile, another group of bird scientists were working on creating a means of stasis through cryogenics so that they could essentially freeze themselves until the trouble passed. The lizardfolk were intended to be their protectors and caretakers. They were engineered to be fiercely territorial so that no harm would end up befalling the laboratories where the birds were in stasis. However, at the same time, they merely viewed the lizardfolk as being tools and were expendable. This sort of callous disregard for life was also reflected in the few stasis pods that were created for the birdfolk. Essentially, there were only enough for the academic caste as well as a few important political figures, and they didn't view that as a problem. So they were happily willing to freeze themselves and just let the rest of the birds figure out the problem themselves. Since the academic caste also included all of their doctors and healers, this was a problem for the remaining castes. Especially given that not only were they being plagued by both demons, but by actual plague itself. And unfortunately, they all perished before the first clutch of lizards actually reached maturity. Eventually, though, those lizards did hatch into a strange, very alien world when you think about it. They're surrounded by this truly advanced technology, but there was nobody around to tell them how any of it worked, so essentially they were just thrust into the Stone Age as a new civilization. In fact, there were only two creatures that could potentially illuminate them. There was Kakalotl's first creation, who became to be known as Hutzazatl, the White Lizard, and there was also Bast. Hutzazatl's experience was one of a test subject, so he didn't really have any true understanding of how any of the science of Tioktal worked. He was aware that the lizardfolk did come from birdfolk, but didn't really understand the relationship that they truly had with each other. Similarly, Bast didn't really concern himself with the science of mere mortals, so he wasn't really interested in how any of it all worked and was more concerned with getting his blood sacrifice. All the same, though, the two were regarded as being wise figures and made frequent appearances within the lizardfolk's oral history. In fact, I actually have a story here from their oral history, which we call How We Lost Our Feathers. Anyway, here's the story. Many turns ago, in the time of our grandfather's grandfathers, were two brothers of legend. Kakalotl was the wise brother, and was covered head to toe in feathers of moonless midnight. Hutzazatl was the bold brother, and was adorned in feathers of pure mountaintop snow. Together the brothers had many adventures. Although they were feathered like our birds of paradise, the brothers could not fly. Hutzazatl despaired of this, for he yearned to feel the wind on his face and in his wings. Kakalotl saw his brother's anguish and swore that together they would touch the clouds. He set out at once to construct an ark that would sail the heavens, and together the brothers laboured for many moons, and alas, the craft was complete. They agreed to set out at first light. That very eve, Ocelot came to pay the brothers a visit. Ocelot was greatly interested in the brothers' ship, but was disturbed to hear that they intended to fly aboard it. It was dangerous, Ocelot warned. The mighty serpent Quetzalcoatl reigned absolutely in the sky and would brook no trespassers. Hutzazatl dismissed the warning, claiming to hold no fear for our island's protector serpent, yet even so Kakalotl grew worried. The next day a storm raged over the brothers as they prepared for their first flight. Kakalotl warned that it was too dangerous, that Quetzalcoatl would not have them sail this day. Even so, Hutzazatl would fly. After the mighty adventures the brothers had, what had they to fear of a little rain and wind? Despite his brother's bravado, Kakalotl refused to board the ship, and Hutzazatl flew alone. The ship flew right into the storm and was buffeted by heavy winds and rain. A brilliant bolt of lightning smote the craft, and Quetzalcoatl rumbled in triumph. Hutzazatl fell to the ground. By some twist of fate, the brother survived, yet was not whole. Hutzazatl's pure white feathers had been seared off, and his skin was burned. Though he recovered, the feathers never grew back, and the skin hardened into scales. Even his children would inherit his deformity. Kakalotl mourned his brother's injury. The guilt at having built the very ark to deliver his brother to his doom weighed heavy on his heart. Exiling himself, Kakalotl retreated to live in the mountains. Never again was he, or his dark feather kind, seen again. So Lizardfolk's oral tradition is just full of stories like that. The Lizardfolk ended up living in the same lands as their Birdfolk ancestors, although it wasn't really suitable for them. The great, grainy maize fields that the Birdfolk found was so suitable for them just didn't really fit the Lizardfolk diet, which was a diet that consisted largely of meat, mostly, although with the exception of poultry. And the grains just weren't really to their palate. They were, however, extremely capable warriors, and were successful in keeping the demons at bay, eventually driving them into a mountain pass where they could not escape from. They sealed the demons up in the pass with a massive stone gate that could not be opened under pain of death. However, the lizards soon had a problem. During their campaigns against the demon and constructing this great gate, they found that the interior of the island was much more suitable to their biology, with the jungles and swamp, as opposed to the great grassy plains that the birdfolk had originally called home. Two factions ended up emerging under the lizards. There were those who were loyal to Bast, who said that the plains were their home and that's where they had to remain. And then there were others who said, well, no, this just feels more right to live in the jungle. And there was great argument among the two of them until eventually they decided that since they can't open the gate at risk of letting all the demons out, they just simply have to decide, half of them are going to live on the island in the interior of the jungles and the other half is going to live in the plains. These two factions lived without any contact with each other, and little is known about the lizards who ended up remaining within the plains for reasons that we'll get into a little bit later. Of the lizard folk who chose to remain in the island interior, they were much more territorial than their avian ancestors and ended up splintering off into various tribes. Additionally, their genetic makeup was much more unstable, which led to some volatile mutations, which ended up becoming prevalent towards the various tribes. So, much like the birdfolk, who had many different species of birds that you could trace their ancestry to, you can see many analogs in lizardfolk and the various types of lizards that you might find on the island, such as the difference between a monitor lizard, a crocodile, and a turtle. Some lizards even attempted the crossing of the stormy waters around Tioktal. Eventually they were successful and ended up settling in the deserts north of Almarayan. In appearance, these ended up being more of a spiny variety of lizard, much like a bearded dragon. As for the lizards on the Isle of Tioktal, they lived without contact from the wider world for well over 1,000 years. However, all good things come to an end, and some adventurers got word that there was a lost city within a sea of gold on the Isle of Tioktal, a strange land surrounded by tempestuous waters that nobody could dare cross. Now, this is adventure bait, if anybody's ever heard it, so of course some brave adventurers did end up chartering a ship in order to take them there and ended up shipwrecked on the island. This group of adventurers would later become known as the Stormbrewers, and their exploits ended up becoming tied to several key events of the setting's history. It isn't long before the Stormbrewers end up making contact with the Lizardfolk, and they explain that their quest is looking for a lost city within a sea of gold. The Lizardfolk know of a place and take them to the Great Gate, which by this point in their history is simply known as being a haunted and terrible place that nobody wants to linger around. The lizards warn them not to open the gate, and try to find another way around if they can, but the treasure that they seek is on the other side of the mountain. After the lizards leave, the party weigh their options. It would be an arduous task to climb this mountain, and going through the gate would be much easier, so the party wizard, a man named Gideon, casts a knock spell on the gate, which, surprisingly, opens it entirely. This roiling, seething black mass of shadows, just a tide, washes right over the Stormbrewers, leaving them alone. However, all those demons were released and end up devouring all of the lizards on the island, leaving not even their bones behind. Talk about picking a bouquet of oopsie daisies. Anyhow, not being the sorts of people to let a little bit of genocide dampen their day, the Stormbrewers are, after all, a party of seasoned adventurers, they decide to press on and ultimately end up finding the city within the Sea of Gold, and are incredibly frustrated to find out that the Sea of Gold is simply a cornfield around the city. I guess that's karma for you. However, corn is an exotic crop in the setting. Nobody had ever established they'd ever eaten any before. So they decide that they're going to take as much of it as they can with them because at least they have something to show for their trip. They also explore the town and find that nobody seems to be occupying it except for a single kitten. This kitten, surprisingly, talks to the party, introduces himself as Bast, and says that he is a great and powerful deity. Only all of the inhabitants of the island simply died, so there is nobody left to worship and therefore believe in him, which is causing him to lose his power. The Stormbrewers agree that they're willing to, offer tribute towards this kitten who is adorable. However, they'll do so only in exchange for helping them find a way off the island. Bast agrees to their terms and tells them where they can find two items that will greatly help them in their bid to escape here. The first is the airship engine that caused all of those problems for them in the first place. And the second is sort of a warding crystal that can protect them against the storms that Quetzalcoatl will hurl at them when they try to fly away. He also warns them not to trust any inhabitants of the dungeons where they can find these items at. The Stormbrewers are ultimately successful in covering these items, but they run into a couple of hitches along the way. The first is that in recovering the airship engine, they do meet a number of birdfolk who have clearly gone insane. They're sort of disfigured and deformed, possibly a result of some kind of a genetic mutation that they used to extend their lives on the island, or maybe they were victims of the plague that somehow survived. It's not really clear exactly what happened to them, as they killed them without really interrogating them. It's one of those shoot first parties. However, in the interest of asking questions later, when they go to the next laboratory where they find the warding crystal, they end up meeting another birdfolk who seems to have his wits about him. He introduces himself as Cacolotl. That's right, Decacolotl, who has recently woken up from a long slumber, is how they describe it. Cacolotl warns them not to trust Bast, which kind of rings a warning to the rest of the party. Bast had warned them not to trust Cacolotl. He lets them leave with the warding crystal without incident, which most of the party take as a sign of good faith and say that, okay, maybe Bast isn't always cracked up to be, or, could potentially have some scheme of his own. However, one of the party, a human gunslinger by the name of Levi, has pledged his undying loyalty to Bast and decides that, no, it's Cacolotl who must be planning some kind of a scheme, and since he's scheming, he, doesn't have our best interests at heart. So on the way out, he shoots him dead. Casual murder aside, and I mean, what's one murder in the wake of a genocide? The Stormbrewers end up returning to Bast and start assembling an airship of their own. They end up confronting Bast while they're at it, saying, if we're not supposed to trust Cacolotl, but Cacolotl says don't trust Bast, what are we to think, right? And the answer that Bast gives in his defense is not very satisfactory. He does, however, urge them to finish building the airship so that they can sail forth and do battle with Quetzalcoatl. The party sends some kind of a plot, so they decide that Bast's fate should be tied to their own and end up taking him aboard with them while they go do battle with Quetzalcoatl. And Quetzalcoatl is a fearsome adversary, too. It's a very near thing, and the Stormbrewers barely survive the incident. Ultimately, they're only successful because the person who chose to be the pilot at the time, an elven bard by the name of Leonard Kitlestouch, decided that he was going to fly the airship directly into the beast at a pivotal moment. The impact sent everybody reeling, and they ultimately ended up losing their warding crystal and also knocked Bast off of the ship and into the ocean. From there, the Stormbrewers leave Teoctol, vowing never to return. Several months later, the Stormbrewers return to Teoctol. In order to save a friend, they need an artifact of extreme elemental power, and what could be more suitable than the very crystal that defended them against the fury of Quetzalcoatl's wrath? The party arrive on their airship, which quickly became their primary mode of transport, and a technology that they carefully guarded. It's not widely adopted into the world yet. So imagine their surprise when they enter Teoctol's airspace, and two more airships show up and demand that they immediately land near the city. It seems that the birdfolk have been awakened from their stasis, although not without incident. They report that when they awoke from stasis, a great white beast preyed upon them, and they barely made it out with their lives. In fact, some of them didn't. However, the birdfolk had another problem too. An unexpected side effect of their long-term stasis ended up rendering most of them infertile. This would spell a disaster for their species within a generation or two. Their top scientists believe, and admit that it might be a long shot, but they had frozen some eggs in stasis along with them, and they might not be affected in the same way that they were. The catch, however, is that the eggs were held in the same facility as the rest of them, which is currently being guarded by that white monster. The Stormbrewers agreed to help them out in exchange for help finding the warding crystal that they're after. An accord is struck. However, before they leave, the High Priest, who was an important political figure and therefore ended up earning a space in the cryostasis, let slip that he believes all of this is punishment for them deserting Bast, and that his absence now is a sign that they, do not deserve to continue living. Not strangers to struggling in the face of adversity, however, the Stormbrewers end up going to the laboratory where stasis was being done. There they have a few encounters with the White Beast, and discover that it's actually an intelligent creature, a Lizardfolk, and none other than Hutzatl. Deciding to engage it in diplomacy instead of violence, the Stormbrewers ask what Hutzatl is doing there, and he explains that he is protecting and safeguarding his unborn nieces and nephews. The Stormbrewers explain that if Hutzatl will permit them to take some of the nieces and nephews, that they can actually allow them to hatch and grow up into new feathered friends. Hootazadal is wary and declares that he will not permit the eggs to be out of his sight. So the Stormbrewers counter and say that, well, they do belong to the Birdfolk, so why don't you come with us? We can take the eggs out, and together we can all let the eggs hatch, and you can bear witness to it. Hootazadal agrees to these terms, and the eggs are delivered to the Birdfolk without any further incident. The Stormbrewers end up departing with their artifact, although the Birdfolk's troubles don't end here. The decision made 1,000 years ago to preserve only their best and brightest was flawed from the get-go. They had viewed the class of peasantry as being, unskilled labor. However, there are still gaps in their knowledge. They have botanists, but not farmers. They have architects, but nobody who can actually construct a home. To further add to their woe, it seems that there's been a sort of cognitive decline amongst themselves. Their long-term stasis appears to have affected them and made them, for lack of a better word, bird-brained. And so, without any sort of demonic influence, it seems that their society is still in a decline. However, having made contact with the Stormbrewers, which must come from some other far-off land, they decide that, maybe it's not a bad idea that some of us can go fly the coop, so to speak. And although theirs is a distant port, they are capable of committing some trade with other notable areas such as Almerion and Landenport. Many Birdfolk actually end up settling there too. So now, both Birdfolk and Lizardfolk populations are in severely limited numbers when you compare them to the other races of the land, but right now, in the modern day, they're feeling pretty hopeful. And there you have it. That's the origins and modern history of the Birdfolk and Lizardfolk in the Last Night's Table setting. I think it was a pretty twisted sort of origin that just kept getting weirder and weirder as it developed, but it was definitely a lot of fun when we were playing through it. If you made it all the way to the end, feel free to like this video or subscribe to my channel. Also feel free to drop a comment suggesting what I might discuss in the next Wider World episode. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.